Okay, well, welcome to Photoshop. This is the first cab off the rank, and it's kind of going to be a Photoshop mixed with Lightroom tutorial. It's not a be-all and end-all tutorial, and it's by no means the limit of anything you can do in Photoshop, but it's kind of an 80 for 20 for most of the things that you'll use in Photoshop on a day-to-day basis. Why is Photoshop and Lightroom combined? Mainly because the way that you'll use Lightroom, you can do it within Camera Raw in Photoshop, but that's jumping ahead of it. This is for people who've, I guess, never used Photoshop before, but also maybe you've used it a little bit before, or you've played around with it, or you may have, used it from time to time, or you might consider yourself fairly adept. And if you do, well done, that's great. But I guess really we're going to kind of go back to the same point that even the beginners do, because it's good to, I guess, unteach bad habits or learn kind of the right ways to do things. And now, don't get me wrong, there's a right way and there's a wrong way for sure, and there's an ends to a means, and there's a million and one ways to get to an end. However, there are definitely some rules that I guess at Aptent we like to follow, but I mean, in particular, to make you a better graphic designer following a lot of these rules. And so before we jump into like kind of the overview and the user interface of Photoshop, we'll kind of talk about some fundamentals and I guess some rules of how to use Photoshop. And yeah, we'll jump right into it. I guess rule number one is operating with a non-destructive workflow. And that means that instead of merging layers together, you're creating separate layers where you can turn them on or off. Now, if you've never used Photoshop before and you're like, what the hell is a layer? Don't worry about it, we'll get to it, but just take this in and absorb it. Another example is, not cropping. Pretty much a non-destructive workflow is a short and abridged way of saying we want to be able to undo the steps that we've done really easily. And you'll see in many use cases why that's necessary. Also just to preserve the original image, which is also important. But yeah, also doing stuff like masking, and maybe you've used Photoshop before and you're like, oh, I hate masking, I don't mask, I can do it in other ways, but trust me, once you learn how to mask, it'll be your best friend. And then that leads us into the second rule, which is a non-destructive workflow. I really can't reiterate how important it is to use a non-destructive workflow, particularly because, if you are adept with Photoshop and you used Photoshop before and you've operated without a non-destructive workflow, well, you're the only one that's using it. But if you're then jumping into a team where a bunch of different people are, trying to finish the same project together, well, then you need to all be operating in a way that's the same, but also so that you can tweak maybe the different parts of what each other's done, you know what I mean? So yeah, I think that's kind of really the important part of why you should have non-destructive workflows, because multiple people might touch this bit of work and people need to know at what process this bit of work is at. And then that leads us into rule 3, which is that there is a way to do something, as I've mentioned before. There's a million and one ways to do something in Photoshop, but then there's the Aptent way to do something. Now that is a non-destructive workflow. That is acknowledging the fact that multiple people might be working on the one project, so you all need to have a succinct and I guess direct, but also the same way of doing something. There's multiple different ways you can reach an outcome, but really what's important is that you'll follow the same method. And that can be simple things like naming layers and groups or using masks, but as I said, we'll get to that later. For now, just remember that the rules are: number 1, use a non-destructive workflow. Number 2, use a non-destructive workflow. And number 3, there's a way to do something, and then there's the Aptent way to do something. Cool, I'll see you in the next video.